Whether it's your first birthday with us today or your seventh, there are a few of those still left around. I'm really honored that you are here today. We are going to have a lot of fun. After service is over today, if you didn't know, Karina just kind of mentioned it there, but there's an after party in the back, and the food truck, Cat's Craft Barbecue that's back there, that's already bought and paid for. It's completely free, and it's real delicious. So there's a reason that this is 3 years in a row that we've used them. So we would love to have you guys stick around for the after party today. Again, whether it's your very first, even if it's your very first week today, we don't care. Today's just a gift to you, and we just wanted to be able to celebrate together. So today we are going to take some time, and we're going to look at two stories. Birthdays are a fun thing in general because birthdays, whether it's your birthday, whether it's a kid's birthday, whether it's a parent's birthday, just birthdays are fun for a lot of reasons, but one of them is it's just a natural time to look back and to look forward, kind of both at the same time. To look at where you've been, to look at where you're going. And for us, that's always been a very fun thing to do. If you do stick around for the after party, or if you got here early enough to take a look, we've got a big timeline out there of kind of the history of City North told visually. We started that a couple years ago, and it's one of the things that's quickly become a favorite of everybody that's here. A lot of people like to look at it and tell me how young I looked in the pictures pre-launch. I don't know what that means exactly, but I guess I'll take it. So it's quickly become a favorite because it's a really neat way to see back. For most of us in this room, we weren't around in those early days. For some of us, we were. And so we're going to look back a little bit today at the story, the genesis, the birth of City North. But we're going to do it through the lens of another story of a different group of people that were called by God thousands of years ago. In Exodus chapter 16, the nation of Israel has been miraculously freed from slavery in Egypt by God. Many years before, he had called a man, and he had said, hey, I'm going to make you into a great nation, and I'm going to bless the world through you. And you're going to have as many descendants as the sand on the seashore, the stars in the sky. Your family's going to be great. And that family began to grow, and they were God's chosen people. And God had promised Abraham that he would give them a land to occupy, to inhabit, that would be theirs. But things didn't go great, and eventually the nation of Israel, Abraham's family, they ended up slaves in Egypt. And after being there for about 400 years, God did a series of miracles to finally convince the Pharaoh of Egypt to set all these slaves free. And then as they were leaving, God did another miracle on the banks of the Red Sea. When it looked like all hope was lost and fear overtook the nation of Israel, God did a miracle and parted the Red Sea and let Israel through. And then on the back side of that, they entered into a desert wilderness. Now, I've never been in their shoes. I like to think and imagine that maybe I would be grateful. But what ends up happening very quickly is what happens to so many of us in our lives. What has happened to us many times, what probably will happen to us many times in the future. What happens is as the nation of Israel enters into the desert, they begin to become afraid. The thing about fear that's so dangerous is that really at its core, fear is like the arch enemy of faith. I don't know that you can really have faith if you're living in fear. Because when we live in fear, we try to control things. When we live in fear, we don't make decisions based on trust. When we live in fear, we try to make sure that things make sense to us, regardless of what God asks. And this is what happens to Israel almost instantaneously when they enter into the desert. All of a sudden, they have no food. They don't know where water's going to come from. They don't know how long the journey is going to take, and they become afraid. And this story from 2,000 years ago reminds me of a cycle that's happened in the life of City North Church. It's happened in my life. So we're going to look at Israel first. We're going to talk about a truth that we can learn from their story. And then we're going to tell a little bit of our story today. We're going to pick up in Exodus chapter 16, starting in verse 1. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. So pause real quick. We got a lot of scripture to cover today, so I'm not going to do a ton of interjection, but I want to break right here. They're 2 months into this journey. 2 months. Now, if you don't know the story, spoiler alert, it ends up being a 40-year journey. 2 months is real early in 40 years. Right? Also, 2 months is real early when you just watch God deliver you from slavery in Egypt and part a sea to get you through on dry ground. But already 2 months in, you see what starts to happen. Verse 2, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron, their leaders. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There, we sat around pots of meat. We ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Things are not going well on the journey. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you." In other words, I'm going to do a miracle. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. That's an important line. Keep it in the back of your mind for now. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I will test them. I'm going to see whether they're going to listen to me. On the 6th day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. So pause. The people grumble. They don't have food. God says, "I'm going to do a miracle." And then he says, days 1 through 5, everybody's going to grab just enough for that day of this miracle food that I'm about to provide. On day 6, they're going to gather a double portion. And he doesn't say anything about day 7. So Moses and Aaron, they go and they tell the people, they give them the instructions, and that very day, God begins to provide for Israel in a miraculous way. We're going to pick back up a few verses later in verse 13. This section is not in your message notes because I just couldn't fit it. Follow along. That evening, quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" But they did not know what it was. In other words, they had never seen this thing before. Moses said to them, "That's the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded." And he reminds them, everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent. The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they measured it by the omer, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone gathered just as much as they needed. Then Moses said to them, and he reminds them of the Lord's instructions. He says, "No one is to keep any of it until morning." However, in the span of 2 short months, Israel had already forgotten to listen to what God said. Some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept a part of it until morning, but it was full of maggots, and it began to smell. So Moses was angry with them. Each morning, everyone gathered as much as they needed. And when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, just like God had said. 2 omers for each person. And the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, and he reminds them again of the Lord's commands. "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning." Now, keeping in mind what has happened up to this point, the first 5 days, for all the people that tried to keep bread until the next morning they woke up and it was full of maggots and smelly. But this time, Moses says, God commanded us to keep it. So they saved it until morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. "Eat it today," Moses said, "because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather, but on the 7th day there will not be any." Nevertheless, some of the people, and some of you are sitting here like, these are my children in this story. Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they found none. You may have heard this story before, you may not have. Typically, when we talk about this story, we talk about the miracle of God's provision. And that's absolutely true. But there's a nuance to this story of the miracle of God's provision that I think is profound. God gave Israel instructions and said, "Hey, I'm going to provide you this thing. On day 1, take just enough for that day." And then the next day it was rotten. And then God provided for that day. Take just enough for that day. The next day it was rotten. Take just enough for that day, for 5 days. And then on the 6th, God says, take enough for 2 days. Now, I don't know about you. I'm a pretty logical fella. That sounds dumb. Hey, God, we've been, like some of us have, we've tried to outsmart you here. We've been keeping it. That's not going so great. So why would we do that? Well, they do it. And the food's fine the next day. See, this isn't just a story about the miracle of God's provision. This is a story about the miracle of God's provision for exactly the season of need. And while those are connected, there's a nuance that is so important. God didn't just give Israel what they needed. He gave them what they needed for a specific amount of time. There's a reason for that we're going to get to in a moment. But ultimately, what this did for the nation of Israel at this moment was it gave them that sense of security and safety that they were missing. They were afraid they weren't going to have enough to eat. And all of a sudden, God began to provide, and he began to provide over and over and over and over, day after day after day after day, building in a natural rhythm by which they would have to sit and think, that bread should not be good again today. Every 7 days. It was a way for Israel to remember that this was a miracle provision from God for exactly the right amount of time. What's interesting is that as the story continues, we find out that God eventually commands Moses to keep some of the bread. He says, I want you to keep some of it, put it in the Ark of the Covenant. I want this to be a reminder to my people for the generations to come of what I've done. And then the story closes with a very interesting but easy to pass by line that reinforces that I think that this story is not just about provision, but it's about provision for the right amount of time. In verse 35, it says, the Israelites ate manna 40 years until they came to a land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan. Now, the border of Canaan, that's the promised land that God had promised to Abraham hundreds of years before. Don't miss the significance of this. God took these people in a desert. They grumbled, we're going to starve to death. God said, I'm going to provide you exactly what you need on this day, what you need on this day, what you need on this day, on this day. And he provided exactly what they needed every day for 40 years. And then when they got to the border of the place where they could provide for themselves, he stopped. Interestingly, in my research for this, I found out that there have been researchers that have tried to figure out like a natural phenomenon for this manna thing. And there are several different things that are very, very similar in this desert. It's very common for there to be a very thin dew on the ground that at times almost materializes into an edible substance. You know what's interesting? You don't have the 1, 1, 1, 1, 2 pattern. Doesn't exist. This is God's provision for a day, for a day, for a day, for a day, for 2 days. Over the span of 40 years, the exact amount of time that Israel needed it, period. God provided exactly what they needed for a season. He gave them security in that season. He gave them exactly what they required, no more, no less. And he did it for a very specific reason. We're going to get to that reason in a moment. But what we learn in this story, and as I jump in a moment to the story of City North, what I want you to understand is that principle that in every season, God provides what is needed. That is at the core of this story. That is at the core of our story. That is at the core of your story. You may or may not even recognize it in your life. But every person that has ever followed God, when you look back at a certain point in time, you'll begin to notice what God did for Israel in the desert, he has done for me. He has provided exactly what I have needed for exactly the season that I have needed it. No more, no less. I began by talking about fear. Do any of you remember the show Fear Factor that was on? I don't know, it might still be on, I have no idea. I never actually watched that. I'm one of those people that just thinks it's dumb to scare yourself. I think it's stupid. I don't understand it. Like, why would you do that? That's stupid. If you like to go to haunted houses and stuff, that's dumb. I don't understand you at all. And that's fine. You're allowed to be wrong about life. Like scary movies, why? Just why? Like, it's stupid. There's just no point at all. I don't understand it. So, what's interesting, so I never watched Fear Factor, right? But I understand the premise underneath it. The premise is like, if you expose yourself to the thing that you're scared of, theoretically, at some point in time, you may be able to then deal with that fear. I think it's called exposure therapy, maybe something like that. I might be wrong. Don't quote me on that. That's the idea behind it. Interestingly, what I found in my own life, what I found through the story of City North that I'm going to tell you in a moment, is that the only way that I've learned to deal with not operating from a place of fear is by watching how when I'm fearful, God provides again and again and again and again and again and again. Often in ways that I did not anticipate, I did not expect. I couldn't have even planned it. And then looking back and going like, well, I didn't even know I needed that thing, but what God provided was exactly that thing. And over a certain amount of time, if you follow God long enough, if you're obedient to Him long enough, you'll begin to realize that there's a peace that comes because you're not afraid anymore. Because you know that no matter what comes your way, God's not going to fail. There's a reason we sang the songs we sang this morning. When I was 15, God called me to be a pastor. Being that I was 15, I thought pizza and video games sounded great, so I was going to be a youth pastor. And that was funnier than, that was a funnier joke. So I believe God called me to be a pastor, and I had my pastors kind of confirm that for me. It was a whole thing. And so I began to give my life to the church. And I served my local church that I grew up at. I grew up at a church in New Albany, just down the road. I began to give my life to that church and to serve. I began to, at one point, I started a worship band with some friends of mine, and I have no earthly idea why anyone ever paid us to do anything, but we actually got to where some people paid us to travel around Central Ohio and do some youth stuff and lead worship in some churches and things like that. Then I went to Mount Vernon Nazarene University and pursued a degree in youth ministry. While I was there, I played in the chapel worship band. So I played a couple times a week and helped lead students in worship. And I traveled with music and ministry teams, leading worship at youth camps and stuff throughout the summers. And I just tried to immerse myself in doing all that I could to help people know Jesus. In 2008, I graduated with a degree in youth ministry, and I started my first job as a youth pastor in Winfield, West Virginia. And it was my wife's home church, and I did not fit in there. I'm from suburban Columbus, and I just always felt like a square peg in a round hole. I didn't understand the culture. I didn't understand the people. If you've ever lived in Appalachia, you know it's just a different world. And I just never quite felt like I fit in. And it was hard. For 3 years I was there, and there was sort of a constant fear that I was just going to get fired. It never happened, but at one point it was actually so significant that my father-in-law got on the church board. This is not the reason to get on a church board, by the way. But he got on a church board just to essentially make sure that nobody was going to pull something behind the scenes and fire me. Didn't happen, but it was a hard season. Then in 2011, man, things changed. I got a call from a guy that was one of my very best friends in the world. We had talked for years about working together, and he thought about church differently. I thought about church differently, and he had planted a church about a year before he called me. And they were growing like crazy, and it was actually one of the fastest growing churches in our denomination at the time. I grew up Nazarene, and it was one of the fastest growing churches in the denomination. Like, people were paying attention to it. He called me, and he's like, hey, man, it's time. We're going to do this. So I came in for an interview. I got through the interviews, and they offered me a job, and I came in, and I was his number two. I was his right-hand man. I was his first full-time hire. So I came in to do youth ministry, and I was there for about 2.5 years. And then in September let me back up. I thought that we were going to be there for the rest of our life, like truly thought this was my landing zone. I imagined our kids graduating from high school together one day. It was everything I ever wanted. And I was working for my very best friend. In September of 2013, so a couple years in, Brooklyn, our oldest, was born. And when she was born, Vanessa, we had been having some issues. Vanessa went into a really deep postpartum depression, and it just messed with our marriage bad. Now, what I also didn't recognize was that as good as things seemed on the surface, I was not good. I was not okay inside. I was angry, and I was arrogant, and I was prideful. And a lot of what I was excited about with the church that I was working at was that I would get to show all the youth pastors in our denomination that they were idiots, if I can just be really blunt. I thought we were something. And kind of the capstone of that was in December of 2023. We had a Christmas party for the youth group that I led, and we had like 55 kids there. It was incredible. And then everything came crashing down on January 9th of 2014. I walked into my office that day, and my friend said, hey, we need to have a conversation. And as soon as he sat down, I knew there was something wrong. And he looked at me and he said, I'm really sorry, but you can't work here anymore. And I was like, what? And he kind of laid out this scenario for me, and in the moment, a lot of it didn't make any sense, but all I knew was that as of that day, everything that I thought my future was gone. And all the hope and all the joy that I thought I felt leading into that, in an instant, it vanished. I was wounded and I was hurt. I felt so alone. I felt so isolated. I didn't know who was involved. I didn't know, all my friends were there. I didn't know who had betrayed me, who had not, who had my back, who didn't. I knew that these teenagers who were like my own kids, I had to go tell them that I was no longer going to be their youth pastor, and I couldn't throw their pastor under the bus, but I wanted to be honest, I just was so stuck. And I was broken and I was hurt. And in the months that followed, in the weeks and months that followed, they were so dark. I was so depressed. I was on the verge of losing my family. Brooklyn was 4 months old when I got fired. I didn't know, I had no idea what was going to happen. And I was so afraid. Well, fast forward, and God showed up, as he does. And God began to heal and restore me. And God provided a job, and he provided some safety and stability. But critically, what God began to provide me was relationships. He injected relationships into my life that I didn't even know I wanted. He injected a pastor into my life that I really didn't want. He injected a new church home into our lives that neither one of us really wanted. But I had to make money, and a youth ministry degree is not super marketable. And God provided relationships and people that we didn't know we needed in the season. And he began to heal me. He began to heal us. He began to work on our marriage. And as it happened, about 15 months later, God put something new in my heart when he called me home to start a church for people like me who had been hurt and broken by church, who felt hopeless, who felt alone, who felt like nobody saw them. Now, I never wanted to be a senior pastor, at all. I was perfectly content to not be the one in charge. But God said, I want you to do this. And as Vanessa so eloquently told this morning, I told her about it, and she said, she misquoted herself. She said, that's a stupid idea. That was what she said. And I said, okay, good talk. And then a couple weeks later, God talked to her. And we began to pursue training and resourcing. We had no idea what to do, and eventually, we moved back to Columbus, to Sunbury, in March of 2016, a little over 2 years after my world fell apart. And from the darkness of that season to the hope of planting a church, couldn't have been more different. All the fear, all the worry, all the anxiety was now wrapped up in all this hope and God has done something new, and he's going to do something great, and he's going to redeem all that pain, and it's going to be amazing. And it was. But it was hard. One of the hardest moments in the pre-launch phase came. We were 10 weeks out from launch, and we didn't have any place to launch from. We didn't have a home. We had looked for facilities, and nothing happened. Everything fell through. Didn't feel great about anything. We had no home. And we were starting internally to talk about, do we need to push this launch back? And that felt like a huge failure to me, and I was scared to fail, as a lot of us are. You know what lie ran through my head a lot at that point? If you don't launch this thing when you said you're going to, it's just going to reinforce that all those people were right a long time ago. You are a failure. 10 weeks out, no facility. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, God provided. I walked one day into the doors of Genoa Middle School in northern Westerville. I went in, I had met with several schools at this point. I went in and talked to their administration, and they were like, well, we got to talk to the custodian, because the custodian, if you're talking facility rentals, the custodian is it. You got to make friends with that guy. And so they're like, they bring the custodian in, and we start chatting, and we start walking down the hall toward where we thought we would want to use the building if we used it. And we're chatting, and he's like, so tell me about what you're doing. Oh, we're going to plant a church. We want to meet out of a school. And he gets this look on his face, and he goes, oh, that's awesome. My church meets in a school. And it was like God just went, here it is. What I didn't know, I thought that God was just providing us a building. What I didn't know was God was providing us a person that we needed. Sean Gorsuch became a good friend to me, but more importantly, what Sean did was he paved the way for an unbelievably smooth first year as a church. If there were problems, Sean went to bat for us. If there was something that we didn't set back up right when we left the school building, Sean covered for us. We had no issues with the school in our first year, none, zero, because Sean Gorsuch was our ally that we didn't know we needed. In an act of incredible providence on God's part, on Friday night, we were at the Big Walnut football game, and I was kind of running around doing some different things, and all of a sudden, somebody, I think it was Courtney, hollered at me from up by the counters, and she was like, "Hey, somebody wants to talk to you." And I look up, and for the first time in 6.5 years, I saw my friend Sean. He was at the football game Friday night. He still works for Westerville City Schools, and he had driven up like a band bus, and he said, "The whole way driving up here today, I was thinking about you. Just wondering how you're doing and hoping your church is still doing great." I took a picture with Sean. I didn't know I needed him. God knew. And if you think it's coincidental that I haven't seen that guy in 6.5 years and I saw him Friday, you're crazy. The first year of our church was hard, but God gave us Sean. He didn't give us a building. He gave us a person to be our advocate and to be our ally who helped us in ways that I didn't even know we needed. Well, fast forward, eventually God said that he told me that he wanted us to move to Sunbury because this is a whole part of the story. I was too stubborn. I didn't like Sunbury growing up, whatever. So God needed to move me as close to Sunbury as possible and then be like, "Hey, there." And he did. So he provided a new facility for us. Now, understand that going into that, there was a lot of fear because at Genoa, we were settled. We were good. We knew what we were doing. But then God said, "Go to Big Walnut." And so we did it. And it was exciting. But man, year 2 was way harder than year 1. It was just harder. Big Walnut was a bigger facility. The load-in was harder. And our church shrank. And it felt like, okay, God, I'm following you here. I'm doing what you're asking me to do. But now it's not working. Why? And our team got tired. Listen, folks, we had a 26 by 8 foot box truck. There's pictures of it. If you go out and look at the timeline and look early on, Nick's laughing, he remembers that thing. There's a picture of that box truck, 26 by 8 foot, the biggest truck you can buy without a CDL. You can drive without a CDL. That thing was packed to the gills. You could not get another item in it. And every Sunday we set it up and we tore it down. Load in was 7 a.m. Load out, we got out of there most weeks by 1:30 p.m. Every Sunday. Some weeks, there were less people that weren't, there were more team members than other people in our services. That's exhausting. And it was killing our team. And I had a couple people from our team come to me and say, "Andrew, we don't know like what this needs to look like, but this is not working, and if we don't do something, it's going to kill our church." And I had no idea what we were going to do. And then God did another thing, and he provided this facility for us in a miraculous way. And not only did he provide this facility for us, but he provided this facility to us at way less than it should have cost us to rent it. He saved us money. He gave us stability. We didn't have to set up and tear down every week. Our team could breathe. And all that fear of what are we going to do, or like have I made a decision here to kill the church, turned into hope again. And then 2019 was the worst year of the church in a lot of ways. We were stable, but we lost even more people. Our income took a huge dive. We brought in like $81,000 for the whole year. It's hard to operate a church on that. Let me just let you know. And again, it felt like God, you've brought us to this place and there's hope, and now it's like it's crushed, and what are we going to do? And there were a couple of different moments in that year specifically that I could tell you stories where I was convinced we were not going to make it and that all of this had been in vain. And then 2020 came, and God did something exciting. January and February of 2020 were the best months we had ever had, the best 2-month stretch we ever had as a church. It was like God gave us a year to breathe and to start to heal, and he injected new life, and all of a sudden we started to grow like a lot. And we were so excited and so hopeful. I remember our team looking at each other being like, what's happening? Like, we don't even understand what's going on right now. January, March of 2020. And then if you're a student of history, March of 2020 happened. And the COVID pandemic turned the entire world on end. And we were afraid again because we thought we had to be. We didn't know what was going to happen. We had all this momentum going into COVID. We didn't know what was going to happen on the back end. And I, like many pastors, were very afraid that it would fundamentally change or even kill our church. And then July came and we restarted services because we had a space that was big enough and we were a small enough church that we could make it work. And things kind of picked up where they left off and it was exciting and there was some hope, but it was still like apprehensive. And then God did something crazy. I know a lot of pastors. I've talked to a lot of them about what happened to their churches during COVID. And then they ask me about what happened to ours. And I feel bad to share our story. Because when almost every other church in America did this, we did this. We doubled in size, we tripled our income during the COVID pandemic. Let me make an adjustment. God did that. It's almost as if God went, here, you try all your things for a few years. It ain't gonna go well. I'm gonna wait for a global pandemic when you can claim no credit for a singular thing that happens and watch what I can do. And he did it. And all the fear that gripped us during COVID, I was jacked. Listen, we went the biggest week we'd ever had was 63 on a normal Sunday. The last Sunday of October of 2020, we had 71. The next week we had 81. And we were like, what is happening? How do we even, lots of people. I mean, we were totally overwhelmed. We had no idea what was going on, but God did. And here's what I want you to see through that story. Moment after moment after moment after moment, season after season after season after season, God gave us exactly what we needed in that season to make us who he needed us to be for the next season. And then he gave us exactly what we needed in that season to make us who we needed to be in the next season. And every time there was a season where there was fear, God went, would you knock it off? It's as if God has taunted me for all these years. You know what I can do, man. In every season, God provides exactly what is needed. That's what God did for Israel. That's what God has done for City North. I could tell you stories on the back end of that, of 2021 when Bentley got sick and when my dad died and when our church was just full of heaviness and we just didn't know, it just felt like everything was going wrong again. And then attendance kind of dove on the back of it and it was like, oh my gosh, are we here again? And then God said, no, just chill, wait. At every step along the way. See, what I want you to understand is this. City North is not a church that is built on the story of a whole bunch of successful people doing successful things. This is a church that is built 100% on the back of a very good, very faithful, very gracious God who has provided time and time and time and time again, often, usually, providing what we didn't want, but what we needed for a season to prepare us for what was to come. As that has happened, an interesting thing has happened in my heart and in the hearts of many of our leaders that have been around throughout a lot of this journey. We get afraid a lot less. Because it's like, come on. We just have seen God do so many incredible things. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, God tells Israel why he did what he did in the desert. I'm going to read you the story, and then I want to very quickly, I'm going to wrap us up after that. I want to read you this story because what God tells Israel in the desert, or what God tells Israel on the back end of the desert, is exactly what he has taught me over these years. And it is exactly what marks our church now, at the very core of who we are. Deuteronomy chapter 8, Israel is on the verge of entering into the land of Canaan, the promised land where we ended our last passage. Deuteronomy chapter 8, starting in verse 10. When you have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Be careful, you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I am giving you on this day. This, by the way, this is Moses speaking to Israel. He says, otherwise, and then Moses gives the most perfect picture of the heart of humanity. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build your fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. He led you through the vast and dreadful wilderness, that thirsty and waterless land with its venomous snakes and scorpions. He brought you water out of hard rock. He gave you manna to eat in the wilderness, something your ancestors had never known. And then he says, why? To humble you and test you, so that one day in the end, it will go well with you. You may say to yourself, but my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms His covenant, which He swore to your ancestors, as it is today. God provided exactly what Israel needed for a season, to humble them, so that they couldn't become proud, thinking they had built a thing with their own hands. There are prayers that you can pray as a Christian. They're very dangerous prayers. For years, I prayed maybe the most dangerous prayer you can pray, which is, God, break me. That's one. If you don't want to get broken, don't pray that one. See, what God did in my life, the genesis of this church, was He broke apart a very prideful person. And then, when that prideful person thought the pride had been dealt with, He gave him a whole bunch more doses of being humility. I like to tell people now, when you successfully grow a church from 48 to 41 people over 3 years, you can't think you're very good at much. I don't tell you any of my story or the story of City North because I want you to think anything of me. Please understand that. I tell you the story of our church, and I tell you the story of me because it's a story of God. It's a story of God working in a very unlikely person in a very unlikely way. It's a story, if I'm good at anything, it's just believing that God is who He says He is. That's about it. That's all I've got. As many of you know, we're in a season now of uncertainty with our future and facilities again. If you aren't familiar, in January of this past year, Sunbury Christian came to us and said, hey, starting in 2024, we want to kind of take this whole facility back. We've got some things we want to do in it. And they've been unbelievably gracious to us for 5 years. And so we said, okay. And then we went, well, what do we do now? And those of us who have been around, we went, I don't know. But God's going to write another cool story. Because that's what He's done again and again and again and again. And here we are, and we still don't have answers. But there's not one less bit of faith in me that God's going to do something. That in the end, I won't be able to say, look at the strategic decisions that we made. But I'll be able to say, look at what God did when we simply trusted Him for our daily bread today. Because the God that I know, the God that has written the story of this church, is a God who always provides what we need in every season. And so we as a church, what do we do with that? We do exactly what Moses commanded the nation of Israel to do. We stay humble, remembering who led us, who provided for us, and who never, ever failed us. That's it. We stay humble, remembering who led us, provided for us, and who never failed us. If you stay for the after party today, again, there's a timeline out there that's really cool. It kind of tells the story visually of City North, and there's all kinds of pictures up there, except for from year 4, because for some reason in year 4, we just didn't take pictures. Nobody really knows what happened then, but we didn't. But it tells the story of the church visually. One of the reasons why we did that a few years back was to remember who it was that provided us that box truck miraculously from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. To remember how God provided us Genoa Middle School. To remember how God sent us people in specific times. To remember how God sent us facilities at certain times. To remind us of all the dumb decisions that we made along the way that I don't even begin to have time to list out for you today. But how moment by moment, day by day, year by year, God has provided exactly what we have needed for the season that we're in. And in the end, the story of City North isn't going to be a story about people. It's going to be a story about a really, really great God. So, for those of you that have been around, happy birthday. For those of you that are new, happy birthday. We're glad you're here. We'd love to have you be a part of the story that God writes next. Let me pray for us.